Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Kirby Squeak Squad. In the last part we started off the game and finished all of World 1 and now we're in Level 2/World 2 Nature Notch. By and large the worlds in this game are mostly just aesthetic shifts, but there are some gimmicks or mechanics that are largely exclusive to a world in question. Albeit when that happens it's usually tied to one of the usual archetypes that platformers have like ice worlds and the like, but we'll see more of that as we go. For right now, I am one of my favorite Kirby abilities. This is Wheel. It only really does one thing, and that's move forward and be a constant hitbox, but you also move really quick while you're using it. Mind you, Wheel is better in some games than others because it really performs best on a lot of flat grounds. Meanwhile, a lot of Squeak Squad's levels are very up and down and all around with their platform heights, so not the most reliable in this game specifically. So I mentioned last part that this was Flagship's last game as an individual team before the 07 Capcom restructuring. What I want to do, like I've done in other LPs, is talk about the staff in question who worked on this game and all that jazz, where they ended up and what they're still doing today. But we start off actually by talking about the director, Takashi Hamamura, who is kind of all over the place. Date-wise, their first project was working as an animation designer for Bloody Roar 2 be both on the arcade and PlayStation. But after that, they were on King of Fighters EX2. Their first title relevant to this was they were in the special thanks for Fire Emblem Sacred Stones. They were then a planner for Amazing Mirror. They were on Minish Cap as a planner. They were the director of this. They were in the special thanks for Folklore on the PS3. But after that, they returned to working on Kirby for another 3 games, being on the planning team for Mass Attack, a game design for Rainbow Curse, and lead game design for Battle Royale on the 3DS. That stage has notably 2 things about it, by the way. That's first off, the place you're more than likely going to first have to enter one of the caves when a Squeak grabs the large chest before you can, as it's just a really tight room to do that in. But also, we got our first ghost metal piece there, like the Star Seals. That's not going to do anything for right now, but when we collect them all, we're going to unlock something a little bit special. With that said, that is a game-long collection quest. We're not going to be talking about that in depth until, like, the second to last or last video of the series to begin with, which isn't the longest LP in a lot of regards, but worth noting all the same. This is the level you're meant to find Wheel in the first time. It really highlights its strengths. It can go over 1 tile gaps, no issues. If you go over a hill, you're probably going to gain some good air by jumping and all that, but you're also semi-invincible during Wheel. You can go through hazards and all that, as well as over certain other hazards like lava or water. The big thing is that I think you get hit by an attack that's mid-animation, you'll still actively get hit by it because it's an active hitbox. It largely kind of depends, though, and it feels kind of inconsistent depending on the moment. Sometimes, by the way, you'll actively find the large chest earlier in the level, and there's other chests to gain afterwards. It really depends on the level in question, what they ended up doing with it. Usually the large chest is going to be the last one you find, but that's not always going to be the case. Next up in the game's staff is the supervisor, Atsushi Kakuta. This is actually their last project listed on Moby Games, so I'm assuming they probably left the industry in some form. They started on Hyperdyne on the TurboGrafx, which is a game I probably should tackle at some point because, to my memory, that's a side-scrolling robotic shoot-'em-up, which I like doing those. They worked on Arcana, which is a interesting little first-person RPG on the Super Nintendo. But after that, they were in the special thanks for Kirby's Adventure, a director of Alcahest, project manager for Dreamland 2, management for Kirby's Block Ball, special thanks to Superstar, progress supervision on Nightmare in Dreamland, management support in Air Ride, and then this was their last notable project. Afterwards, we actually reached the overall planners, which there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 listed. Takashi Hamamura, who we already talked about, Tomoaki Fukui, Toyohisa Tanabe, Yoshimasa Arita, Kenji Matsuda, Shigeki Morihira, and Taiki Ubukata. Going down that list, I think we've already talked about Tomoaki Fukui before. They were the director of Amazing Mirror, but they also were a producer for some early Samurai Showdown games and all that. They were an advisor on Mass Attack. They were director support on Marvel vs. Capcom 3's base release. But they actively were in the news again relatively recently because they are the main director for Shadow Labyrinth, the Metroidvania Dark Pac-Man game that came out this year that I haven't checked out yet, but I won't lie, is kind of tempting because it's just such an absurd idea. Notably, they do try to kind of put certain members of the elites in the Squeaks in very specific positions when you fight them. Storo is usually in very small areas, so he can take advantage of his slow speed but high damage to try and hit you quickly. Doc, they'll try to put in areas that are very closed in, and you have to go long ways around level design-wise so he can catch up to you through the walls. Meanwhile, Spinny, on the other hand, tends to be in very closed-in but flat areas that are long, so he can take advantage of his speed to try and catch up with you. They're very smart with how they play each single Squeak throughout the game, and they're also really good about giving each of them a good amount of screen time, so you kind of don't know which one you're going to run into next. Alright, so we got a new copy palette there, as well as an ability scroll for Wheel. Wheel's ability scroll is interesting, but it doesn't come up that often. What it does is that now whenever you roll with Wheel on top of certain elements like lava or ice blocks, the Wheel will gain the attributes of that ability, allowing it to say light certain things on fire, burn enemies, freeze enemies and all that, freeze water beneath you if you hit ice. But it doesn't come up too often, and honestly, out of all the abilities that an ability scroll gets, it's one of the ones I think about the least. This level's core mechanic is boulders. The boulders can actively destroy the... I'm actually not sure what the name of this block type is that's usually connected to the bomb blocks. But it can actively break those and allow you to access certain areas, or in most cases, open up a bottomless pit. The most annoying treasure chest in this stage, quote-unquote, is this where you need to really just get up to it before the rock can, because otherwise it blocks access to it. But as you can see, that's a pretty short level, as a lot of levels in this game can be. Next up in the planning team is Toyohisa Tanabe, where they were a planner on Amazing Mirror, a coordinator on Sacred Stones. They planned on this. They were then in a similar role to what we've already mentioned with Folklore. They were a level designer for Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. Mass Attack, they were planner. Direction support for Marvel vs. Capcom 3's base release. Planner for Shadow Labyrinth. What's worth noting about them is that prior to their work on Amazing Mirror, they were all over SNK staff. They were on various Capcom vs. SNK and King of Fighters projects dating all the way back to the original Art of Fighting on the Neo Geo CD as an object designer. But even then, their first role was as a designer on Baseball Stars Professional in the arcade back in 1990. There's Wheel absorbing the fire. With that said, don't turn when you're on lava, as in some cases, if you're on top of another fire sprite, that will make you take damage, and yeah, that's rough. Worth noting, whenever there's an elemental hazard like fire or water, enemies will also get damaged by it, but especially if your copy ability star touches the lava or gets in the water or is in there for too long, it will pop and you will lose access to it. It's moments like that that I really recommend you always have one copy ability on standby that you like in Kirby's stomach, just so you have access to it should you lose the other. This is the metal mini-boss. I'm actually not sure what the name of this thing is at the top of my head, but it moves pretty slowly and generates a lot of rocks that fall from the ceiling. It can also roll across to the other side of the room, but this is the first time we actively need to gain metal as an ability to get a treasure chest. And yeah, I really don't like metal. You move really slowly, you need to really mash the shit out of the A button to hover and all that, and its only attack without the ability scroll is a ground pound where you jump and press the B button. But we need to break these blocks here using it in order to get the next treasure chest. With that said, goodbye metal. I'm not using you for a good amount of the LP moving forward unless I need to for a treasure chest. Next up in the planning team is Yoshimasa Arita. Their first project was being a coordinator on Sacred Stones. They were then a planner on this. Same role as Game Republic Special Thanks over in Folklore, level designer for Radiant Dawn. They were a script director for Personal Trainer Walking on the Nintendo DS, which I think I've seen that in a bargain bin several times in my life. Then they were a planner for Mass Attack, and that's the last role we know of for them. Kenji Matsuda, on the other hand, in the planning team, is actively still in the industry, just a little less often. They started on Samurai Shodown 64 in the arcade as a planner. They were on the system section of Sam Show 64 Warrior's Rage. They were a scenario supporter on Sacred Stones. They were a planner on this. Then we didn't see them again until 6 years later in a notable role in Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City as an assistant director. The PC port of Resident Evil 1's remake, they were a game designer, but then they were a lead game designer for Mega Man X Legacy Collection, and then they were a planner on the PS5 version of Street Fighter 6. So I think that's the first dev we've seen that's still actively working with Capcom very regularly. In that level, we got the ability scroll for Beam, which is an ability scroll I appreciate, but it takes me a while to remember what it actively does. It changes the visuals of the beam attack, and I think it makes it more damage and move faster, but worth noting, if I believe it hits the floor while it's going across, it'll send 2 electric sparks in either direction, left to right, and that can be used to throw off some enemies in some cases, but Beam is an ability that I use very sparingly in certain games because its attack arc is just long enough where I can take a lot of dumb hits with it if I place myself in a bad way. Out of the more traditional power-ups, it's one I like, but it's one I won't use first. Meanwhile, Fighter allows me to be Ryu from Street Fighter, and that has a lot of utility. You know, it's plain, but Sword is, to this day, one of my favorite Kirby abilities, just because it's so usable in most instances. Although I still need to pick up, like, Forgotten Land and see how I feel about it in that. I'm probably going to wait until the Switch 2 version comes out at this point, just so I can pick up the Switch 1 version for relatively cheap in comparison, and then get the upgrade pack. This is Bonkers. He's the mini-boss for the Hammer ability. And we actively want to get Hammer because we're going to need it for a treasure chest here. Hammer is Sword, but slower, but more damaging. It doesn't have as many abilities, but it's just so reliable for damage against mini-bosses and boss fights alike. If you can find yourself a bubble of this, hold on to it, because it's going to come in real handy against basically any given boss. Next up in the planning team is Shigeki Morihira, who I've actively covered a lot of the games they've done over the years. Their first project was a game programmer on Turtles in Time on the Super Nintendo. They were then a planner for both Batman Returns on the Super Nintendo and Adventures of Batman and Robin on the Super Nintendo. Then they were in Chibi Maruko-chan Mesaze Minami no Island, which was a Japan-only Super Famicom game done by Konami that I'm not too sure about. I think it's a minigame collection of some sort. They were then on Deadly Arts as a main planner on the N64. Then they were with Flagship for the rest of their listed career, working on Amazing Mirror as a planner, Minish Cap as a planner, and this as a planner. That Golden Waddle Dee, you need to make sure you hit the switch to save it from falling into the pit, because Golden Waddle Dees are special enemies that always contain a chest when you either kill them or swallow them. That seems like a pretty easy chest to get in a lot of regards, but some of them get kind of devious with their rooms later on, so if there's going to be a chest I miss in some stages, it's often going to be a Golden Waddle Dee. Starro, get back here. Thank you. The rooms like this, where they spawn in the Squeak Squad member who grabs the chest first no matter what, you need to race to catch up with them, are always very stressful feeling despite still being pretty easy. It's just the time limit stress before they enter the cavern that makes it feel a lot harder, but even then, especially if it's like Starro and you have a breath ability like fire or ice, you can just enter the cavern after they enter it and combo them into a corner pretty easily. That's our first health upgrade. Again, it's not a large upgrade, but by the time you get all 4 notable ones, your health is so much higher that it really does boost your survivability in boss fights especially. The final member of the planning team for this was Taiki Ubukata, who started as a planner on Amazing Mirror, was a director for Sacred Stones on the Game Boy Advance. They were in the Special Thanks for Path of Radiance, then they were on this, and their most recent project was in the Special Thanks section for the Vita version of Gundam Breaker. That'll be before every boss fight. They will give you a room like this where they usually give you 2 set power-ups, and often a random one just to see what you get. Personally speaking, I would recommend Hammer or a Breath ability for this boss fight, but it really just depends on what you want to do. The boss here is going to be kind of familiar for people who played Amazing Mirror. This is Mrs. Moley, the wife of Moley, a boss from the aforementioned game. She's going to jump out of either of the 2 holes in the foreground to throw projectiles at you or swipe at you, but she'll occasionally pop into the 3 holes in the background, and if she pops out of that in her eye glints, she's going to try to jump out and slam you. All over my life, I have been inconsistent about dodging that attack. Worth noting, if you dodge it and she slams into the rock, she does notably take enough damage that you can actively use that to kill her in some cases. In fact, on my test playthrough of this world, that very thing happened. If you were paying attention at the start of the previous part, you would have noticed there was a file that was already in progress. That was my test file where I played through the next couple levels I was going to record at a time just to remember what I had to do there and then go and record them. Definitely a harder boss than DDD, especially if you're trying to use certain abilities here. But that's just because she does more damage largely, especially with the slam. It's moments like this I really recommend bringing in a healing item at all times to boss fights, especially if you can have a Maximado stored up in your stock on the bottom screen. With that said, it's still a Kirby boss, so if you have a really good ability that you're comfortable with, she's gonna go down pretty quickly. So with that, we're already done here in Nature Notch, so it's time for us to move on to World 3. Welcome to Cushy Cloud, which I believe actively does use its namesake in a couple cases, but I might be thinking of a later world at this point. This game is short enough where it kind of blends together in my mind in some ways, I won't lie. But that is also kind of a case with Kirby in general until the leap to 3D happened, where I think things became a little more visually distinct enough to the point where I can remember more often what's in what game. So the next team listed in the credits for the game is the programming team, which is made up of Yoshinori Hori, Tomoyuki Muramaki, Hiroyuki Fujiwara, Kazunari Usui, Junzo Akatsuka, and Kensaku Fujita. Starting off, Yoshinori Hori, this is their only credited game project that we know of, at the moment at least, unless they're under an alias or a different spelling in other projects. Before I go into the next member, though, this next room is our first appearance of an item/power-up I mentioned offhandedly last time, Laser, that you can get from Doc. We're going to need to use that, I believe, here to get a specific treasure chest. The way Laser works is when you press the attack button, Kirby lowers the visor and fires a laser. But whenever it hits a 45-degree incline, it'll get bounced off of it like light to bounce all over the place across areas. Laser's a classic ability I've always liked, but always felt like it needed more going on. Even with the ability scroll it gets in this game, I feel like it just needs something else in the 2D space at least. But I'll talk more about that later, but worth noting, it did have some notable property changes in this. Notably, anything that fire can light up, like fuses for cannons and all that, Laser can now also light up, which does come in handy in some cases, in the case you don't have the fire ability, but I'd rather have the fire ability in all those cases. It'll come up here for a hidden door that doesn't have a treasure chest in it, but if you want to get either the throw ability or another mini Kirby for an extra life, hey, it's there. The larger star blocks reminds me of something I haven't talked about yet that is still in this game from Amazing Mirror. Notably, if you hold down the inhale button with base Kirby, he'll start inhaling stronger, and you can use that to inhale either larger blocks or larger enemies if you don't want to damage them outright. With that said, it seldom comes up in any context notable to getting 100%, but it's worth noting that they're all the same. I think that can also help you inhale enemies further away in the case you're trying to inhale 2 enemies at once to try and get a mix going that way. This is one of the cases where you really get to see what Spinny can do in a longer horizontal hallway, because his speed is notable enough that he can keep some pretty good pace with you. With that said, it's easy enough just to confuse him by either taking one of the smaller mice and blowing them into him, or absorbing one of his attacks, because he'll just stand there for a second otherwise. Not the hardest to get away from in that case, but there's some longer hallways down the line where he can really catch up to you really quick. So the next member on the programming team is Tomoyuki Muramaki. Outside of working on this, they also worked as a programmer on Shinsekai Into the Depths from 2019, and the Capcom Arcade Stadium in 2021 as another programmer. After them is Hiroyuki Fujiwara, who started off in a programming role on Advanced VG, which I believe is Variable Geo on the TurboGrafx CD. They then worked on Fireland Story 1 and 2 on the Super Nintendo, as well as the PCFX and PlayStation version. They worked on Hell Knight, then they worked on the remake of the first Shin Megami Tensei on the PlayStation 1. After that, Battle Kicks, Sacred Stones, they were a main programmer, Squeak Squad, they were a programmer, Personal Trainer Walking, they were a programmer, Mass Attack programmer. But then in 2017 and 2019, they were a programmer on the Kingdom Hearts 2.8 collection, as well as Kingdom Hearts 3. I want to say this is our first level we've seen water in. Kirby, when swimming, usually loses access to most of his copy abilities. You'll still have them, but your main attack just becomes the water splurt you have with your snorkel. But things like hammer or sword can still be used underwater, no problem. The annoying thing about being in water is that if you take a hit, unless you can just get out of the water really quickly to swallow your ability again, you're probably using it, because the water is effectively a death sentence to most enemies and abilities as it is. And there are ways you can use that to your advantage in some cases, but largely it's just an annoyance more than anything. This is the magic ability. This one's kind of cute. It has a lot of various range abilities. Its base ability is to throw the 3 doves out that move at 3 different trajectories. Pressing up in the attack button does that clown attack that can do some good damage against boss fights. But if you press forward in the attack button at the same time, you throw forward 3 cards that can also be used to cut certain ropes that Cutter and Sword can also be used to cut, I believe. This is notably this ability's second appearance in the series. It's also its last appearance. Its prior appearance was in Amazing Mirror, where it was just a random roulette of what it did, which made for an interesting one-off ability, but in a game like Amazing Mirror, where you want certain abilities to get into certain rooms to get other items done, it definitely felt pretty underwhelming. This as an attack ability is more interesting, and it's one I hope comes back at some point in the series. Because they will bring certain abilities back after long hiatuses just out of nowhere, and usually in much more revitalized ways. Next up in the programming team is Kazunari Usui, who, after working on this, was a programming director for Personal Trainer Walking, and is one of the lead programmers on Shadow Labyrinth, and that's all we got about them. Meanwhile, Junko Akatsuka is a pretty similar story. They were a programmer for Sacred Stones, they were on this, and then we didn't see them again until Dragon's Dogma 2 as a programmer. Wrapping up the programming team for this game is Kensaku Fujita, who, out of the programmers, is probably the most storied one. They started on the remake of SMT1 on the PlayStation we mentioned earlier. They were a programmer on Sacred Stones, this. But then they were a battle and scenario programmer for both versions of Mega Man Star Forces 2 and 3, and then they stuck with Capcom moving forward, working on things like Super Street Fighter 4 as a programmer, MIT Framework for Mercenaries 3D, EX Troopers, Dragon's Dogma on the PS3 as a UI worker. After that, they largely were a programmer for the engine side of a lot of games, being an MT Framework development team member for things like Monster Hunter 3, Monster Hunter 4, Generations, Ace Attorney Dual Destinies. They were on the RE engine staff for Resident Evil 7, and their most recent credit is Grand Blue Fantasy Relink as a chief engineer. In this level is one of the very things I just mentioned a moment ago when talking about magic, by the way. Ropes you can cut with sword, magics, cards, or cutter. I think you can also technically burn them with things like fire, but that doesn't come off as often. And you really want to make sure you have that to get this golden Waddle Dee so you can get the treasure chest. If it falls into the pit, you're out of luck, because if you re-enter the room, it doesn't respawn. You need to actively complete the level and then re-enter it for it to respawn. That's what I mean about them getting kind of tricksy with golden Waddle Dees as you get through the game, because they become much more dangerous ways for it to die quickly. There's one specific room later on that I will always remember, because it's a bunch of switches you need to press, and if you press the wrong one, you're out of luck. Make sure you still have cutter for this room, by the way, because you need to actively press that switch with a delay in order to get the large chest, and the timer on that is pretty strict, all things considered. Make sure you fly over Storo, by the way, because otherwise you're probably going to get damaged by him, and you're probably not going to get to the star door with the chest in question without taking another hit along the way. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 3, we're going to complete World 3 and probably move on to World 4. See you guys then.